Welcome to Advanced Sci-Fi Civilisations Too Stupid to Really Exist. We're back with another entry from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's the Confederacy of Independent Systems, from Star Wars. First, we saw the gargantuan ball-shaped idiocy of the Galactic Empire, the First Order, and the Emperor, but now in prequel fashion we're going back to the era of the Republic to look at a civilization so profoundly stupid they managed to get utterly hoodwinked by a guy we threw tomatoes at for at least 2 videos.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
The Confederacy of Independent Systems is ostensibly an alliance of star systems and various galactic corporations standing against Republic control, with a range of grievances ranging from perceived neglect, corruption in the Senate, and supposedly heavy-handed taxation. But unbeknownst to everyone except Dooku, the Separatist alliance and the coming war are nothing more than a grand charade orchestrated by Palpatine, a closet Lord of the Sith, also known as Darth Sidious. Oh sorry guys, spoiler alert. Who would have thought this calculating politician who just so happens to personally benefit from absolutely everything he has a hand in would end up being a bad guy? The Jedi could literally feel it, and yet they couldn't pick it, and so of course neither did any of these morons. And so I'm finally dragged into the Clone Wars along with everyone else. An epic Star War where every man, woman and thing gets a promotion to general, and everyone has a bad feeling about this in situations where something bad is already well underway.
I've got a bad feeling about this, sir.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Thank you, General Obvious. At least Anakin isn't as much of a Suki Baba, the show doing a far better job of humanizing him and fleshing out his misguided yet well-intentioned motivations.
You risked the mission, all your men, even your Padawan, to save a droid.
This is a hell of a lot better than watching him whine about sand. It's just a shame it took 7 seasons of an animated series that came out long after we needed it.
I can't watch anymore.
So ignite your lightsabers, crack open a fresh vat of clones, and get ready for a ride down the gurgler with the Jedi at the peak of their complacency, taking on Sidious at the height of his mental proficiency and the Separatist alliance in a consistent state of idiocy. Point 1. The shoddy Separatist military is poorly utilized and hopelessly outgunned. The seeds of the Separatist movement and the Clone Wars are sown in the Phantom Menace, when the Trade Federation organizes a supposedly legal blockade of Naboo, an attempt to coerce Queen Amidala into signing an agreement legitimizing their occupation, forcing them into exclusive trade deals that basically amount to servitude. But of course, the Trade Federation are being secretly manipulated by Sidious, who as Palpatine has the Senate chasing their tails gummed up in matters of procedure, helped along by his secret aide, whispering in Supreme Chancellor Valorum's ear. The Trade Federation not particularly capable of holding up their end of the bargain, mostly due to their poor decision making and their terrible choice of military. I'm not sure what kind of threat these fragile little matchstick men were meant to pose. Unfortunately, the Trade Federation probably had no choice but to use droids. The Nemoidians being so bereft of respect and honor, they have to create loyal troops using the only resource they had, money. Well, they're theoretically loyal anyway, we'll get to that. The droid army is eventually defeated in typically idiotic fashion, the Trade Federation stupidly dismissing their blockade after transferring droid control to one solitary ship, only for a young pod racer to blow the thing up, cutting off the control signal and immediately causing all the droids to cease functioning, and some of them even seem to lose their structural integrity.
What?
Though Palpatine's scheme doesn't appear to have gone 100% to plan, he still managed to make the current Supreme Chancellor look weak and ineffective, generating enough sympathy to get himself elected in his place. The Naboo crisis also seeming to serve as a giant test case for his planned creation of a galactic puppet faction and the resulting fabricated war. Sidious perhaps recognizing the Trade Federation military as an easily manageable threat, just formidable enough to not lose the war immediately, and thus the perfect fallible enemy to use for his own ends. Eventually we discover Sidious has been using Count Dooku as a proxy to get this whole thing rolling, some years ago manipulating the Jedi Sifo Dyas into approaching the Kaminoans and commissioning the creation of a vast clone army, then later supplying the Kaminoans with a clone donor, funding and oversight. Dooku goes on to ingratiate himself to the disgruntled factions of the Galactic Republic, founding the Confederacy of Independent Systems in secret secret and developing the first Separatist droid foundry on Geonosis, before getting their party crashed by a legion of Jedi who somehow managed to sneak into this arena despite the majority of spectators being Geonosian. I would just hand-wave all of that by assuming a whole bunch of magic hand-wavy things went down, but apparently the Geonosians are immune to Jedi mind tricks, which to be honest I find extremely hard to believe. Meanwhile, Moron Jar Jar has gifted Palpatine emergency powers, allowing him to activate his new clone army and attack Geonosis, kicking off the Clone Wars in earnest. And none of these Separatist leaders ever wonder why the clones they go to war with all look strikingly similar to that Django guy Dooku was employing.
Jungle!
He doesn't seem to take a hint, this guy.
Nor did any of them recognize the lower half of Sidious's face or his voice, despite them belonging to the most famous person in the galaxy. Welcome to the idiocy of the clone versus robot war, an epic clash of the finely tuned biological versus the poorly designed artificial. The Separatists possessing a greater number of soldiers and ships, but squandering their greater manufacturing ability by pumping out military units of a substandard design. These morons seemingly agreeing that the B-1 should serve as their main foot soldier, though admittedly they have had a few futile tweaks. They apparently don't require central control now, until suddenly they do. Sure, the Separatists do have many superior units and some decent vehicles, but the B-1s represent the bulk of their forces, something that holds true throughout the war. We can understand why Sidious and Dooku are all good with these things, but the rest of the CIS leadership thinks they're fighting for their freedom and autonomy, so they should be extremely concerned. Though admittedly these B1s do have a few advantages. Highly expendable and cheaper to mass produce than more advanced models, the CIS can pump these things out in huge numbers, this being the greatest threat they pose.
Smaller in number, are we? But larger in mind.
Their laughably slight frames would surely cut down on materials as well as represent a challenging target, and being droids, despite displaying copious amounts of artificial stupidity, they're naturally immune to Jedi mind tricks, as well as biological weapons, and they can operate in environments where biologicals cannot. The use of droids also spares CIS civilians from having to fight, not that their lives will be much better for it. The B1s have some useful versatility, their humanoid design allowing them to fulfill a range of different roles, and essentially pilot or control anything a humanoid could. Not that they have the programming to actually operate anything effectively.
I still can't seem to hit anything.
And unfortunately, none of their advantages make up for their legion of shortcomings we witnessed throughout the war.
This is where the fun begins.
For a start, the build quality of the B1s is so poor, regular clones can just rip their heads off like it was nothing. But their general soldiering has to be their greatest weakness. They're afflicted with tactical programming that seems to be woefully inadequate. The B1s seem to fire blindly without aiming, creating a wall of fire and relying on getting a few lucky hits. They're about as accurate as a drunken stormtrooper fresh out of the Imperial Academy with an extreme aversion to killing. Except these soulless droids are completely without compassion, which should be an advantage if they were actually capable of intentionally shooting anything. But in general, the B1s are strangely devoid of many natural advantages you'd think robotic soldiers would possess, such as their lack of ability to communicate and receive orders instantaneously and silently. They seem to almost exclusively rely on verbal commands.
Hold it. Hold it. I said hold it. Wait. That's far enough.
And once they've finally got their orders, their reaction times absolutely suck.
The prisoners are escaping with reprogrammed battle droids. Let no one on board that shuttle.
But perhaps most concerningly, many of these so-called droids suffer from a typically human range of emotional issues.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Such as having a healthy fear of death. But because they exclusively rely on their programming and not their training as human soldiers do, many of them start cowering with fear the second a clone or Jedi gets in their business.
Mechanical glitches would seem to be the least of our problems.
Honestly, if there were any other droid I would compare these guys to, it would have to be C-3PO. They're the same bumbling, bewildered archetype with a touch of pointless rambling. Surely you've got to be concerned when the primary purpose of your soldiers appears to be comic relief. The distinct lack of B1 battle prowess isn't helped along by the fact that many of them seem to experience some kind of simulated pain.
A Jedi is coming. He looks very unhappy.
Here we see one apparently shielding its eyes from hot steam.
Can you feel that?
On occasion, the cowardly B-1s even attempt to surrender, something they shouldn't be capable of.
What kind of nonsense is this?
When they're not cowering from their enemies, they're consistently questioning their orders and offering up inane commentary rather than focusing on the task at hand.
Boy, this is a lot more fun when they're not shooting back. Don't even think about it, Republic dogs. We're too big to fit in there. No, we're not. Watch this.
Other units seem to cope with their own inadequacies by developing a superiority complex and picking on astromechs any chance they get.
Don't talk back to me, droid. I'm in charge.
And these have been but a few of the so-called personality quirks that are actually just fatal glitches, afflicting most if not all of the B-1s, often with massive consequences.
No clones, just explosives. Explosives!
These robotic simpletons consistently suffer from a distinct lack of initiative.
Not us. We're independent thinkers. Roger, 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 roger.
They're easily confused by unexpected situations.
Hey, you're not authorized. Hey, where did you come from?
And utterly directionless without standing orders. The B-1s require constant micromanaging. Case in point, here we see some B-1s failing to attack a group of armed Naboo soldiers in a Naboo city the B-1s were meant to have recently pacified. And then there's the mind-numbingly dumb stuff they get up to whenever a grenade rolls their way.
What the?
You'd think a robotic soldier would have a few inbuilt contingencies for that kind of thing. So it's not surprising that they're also highly gullible, vulnerable to deception of any kind. You can basically just start rambling away about anything, and that'll usually be enough to stall them for as long as you want. But apparently these massive gaps in their programming can sometimes be fixed by simply blasting them in the head. Like this malfunctioning B-1 who switches sides after receiving such damage. I guess that's forgivable, but could someone please explain why it also becomes a far superior soldier, sassing its former comrades left, right and center, operating with better assertiveness and weapon accuracy. So in other words, these B-1s could have been designed to be far more effective with their existing components. It shouldn't even cost you more. Especially unfortunate when you consider that during the course of the war, no attempt is ever made to improve the B-1s at all. As for the B-1 droid commanders, they're barely worth mentioning, supposedly possessing cognitive and tactical upgrades, but ultimately they're hardly any different to a standard B-1.
It would be better if we just surrender now.
And the same could be said for most, if not all, the B-1 variants.
From a tactical point of view, the options are not encouraging.
The more heavily armed and armored super battle droids represent some kind of step up, but then during the conflict they're not deployed nearly enough. It is said the B-1s outnumber them 100 to 1, and they've lost their humanoid versatility being a combat only unit. It doesn't help that like the B-1s they also suffer from weirdly human emotional afflictions. Their programming also seems so basic, they're close to being mute. I hope that means they're just communicating internally, but unfortunately that would be reliant on them having decent leadership.
What that?
Enter the T-Series, supposedly advanced command models designed to formulate battle strategies, direct small armies, and assist the flesh and blood leadership. In reality, they're just as idiotic as any B-1, if not more so, because not only are their strategic abilities severely lacking, they're also blinded by overconfidence, possessing a smug sense of superiority.
I am a droid. I am always right.
Very impressive, even by my standards.
These guys are just making bad call after bad call, and when their complicated probability calculations don't pan out, they're just as bewildered as any B-1.
Their chances of success against us are 742 to 1. Does not compute. Does not compute. Does not compute.
These supposed brain bots' lack of initiative laid bare time and time again. They basically start malfunctioning the second something unexpected happens. Other times, just like the B-1s, they're even trying to surrender. These T-Series military leaders seem to have no capacity for fighting at all. Some of them have trouble even recognizing when they're in personal danger.
Fool, the super tank is impervious to all weapons.
Even more concerning once you consider the inherent drawback of using robots as commanders. There's no need to torture a droid into giving up its intel, you can simply grab its head and get it directly. You'd think rather than be capable of retreating or surrendering, they'd instead be programmed to wipe their memory cores or even better, self-destruct. It's safe to say B1s and their leaders are laughably inadequate when it comes to contending with the clones. The brothers showing themselves to be vastly superior to the B1s by nearly every conceivable metric, and taking advantage of the many exploitable weaknesses of the clankers to no end. But that's nothing compared to the astonishing gulf between the abilities of the B1s and the Jedi. To them, these guys represent about the same level of threat as a youngling training dummy.
You expect victory over Jedi, but all you give me to fight them is battle droids!
Mace Windu tries to terrify a Separatist army into submission by flexing his Clone Wars B1 body count, revealing he has personally dispatched a punishing 100,000 of these things.
At this point of the Clone War, I have dismantled and destroyed over 100,000 of you Type 1 battle droids. I'm giving you an opportunity to peacefully lay down your weapons.
A masterful gambit, sir. Frankly, I'm just surprised that didn't work. Even when the Separatists front with crushing numbers of battle droids, the clones and the Jedi consistently come out on top. Though the Separatists do make incremental improvements to their forces over the course of the war, resulting in some pretty decent units that can somewhat contend with Republic forces, they don't utilize them nearly enough. The droidicas probably represent the biggest threat, requiring specialized tactics and weaponry to effectively repel. The Separatists should be pumping out droidicas like there's no tomorrow, but unfortunately we hardly ever see them, or anything else that hits the mark. The ST series command droids are fairly commonplace and represent a noticeable step up from the T series, not often exhibiting the flaws of their predecessors, though I wouldn't say they're perfect. Often displaying a similar level of overconfidence, but at least they can actually fight when necessary. And in terms of leadership abilities, some of these ST models actually show themselves to be more effective than the top Separatist brass. Maybe things would have turned out better if they'd put them in charge. When it comes to replacing the deficient B1s as low-cost grunts, surely there must have been better options within reach. These commando droids offer a far more meaningful threat than any B1, with increased agility and armor and more advanced programming. They can even mimic voices and have some capacity for deception, though even they have their limits. Superior programming or not, I wouldn't say they're actually intelligent.
Well, if droids could think, there'd be none of us here, would there?
Something more like the IG assassin droids would surely fit the bill. Far more proficient in combat and accuracy, and utterly fearless and loyal like a good robot should be.
Manufacturer's protocol dictates I cannot be captured. I must self-destruct.
Still in possession of the advantages brought about by a narrow profile and humanoid design. Not to mention, they can even be fitted out with a nifty self-destruct mechanism.
I will initiate self-destruct.
Do not self-destruct!
A talented engineer was able to completely refurbish and reprogram this IG model with only a few scraps and
the skill of one's hands.
So surely these things can't be that expensive to manufacture and maintain.
I have spoken.
And what do you know, Holowon Laboratories were selling IG droids to the Separatists already. They had the answer right there among their forces all along.
Beginning self-destruct countdown. No, stop!
Though their military may be in a dire state, it probably doesn't help that for most of the conflict, the Separatists put far more effort into harassing neutral worlds, rather than attacking important Republic targets. Point 2. The Separatists force potential allies into the arms of the Republic. The Confederacy of Independent Systems is made up of many thousands of star systems, with only a small handful receiving any benefit from the alliance and even fewer receiving special treatment. The member nations were meant to have greater autonomy and independence than membership in the Republic granted them, with the freedom to administer their worlds as they see fit. But in practice, they lose their autonomy completely, forced to continually supply resources and support for the war effort.
Make a motion in the Senate where that kind of a request belongs.
Dooku having been granted executive wartime powers in a similar manner to Palpatine, allowing him and the other council members to overrule any and all legislation passed by the pointless Separatist Senate.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
The CIS is a democracy in name only. Ironically, most of the systems of the Confederacy of Independent Systems are anything but independent. In reality, the Confederacy functions as a gigantic one-party dictatorship, with the less important systems and factions treated basically like fiefdoms. It's another command economy reminiscent of North Korea or Pan Am. As the war progresses, it is fought on numerous front lines, including the actual battlefield and the political theatre. The Confederacy and Republic fighting over the loyalties of neutral undeclared worlds, who in turn will be able to supply new resources for the war. An effort severely hampered by Dooku & Co, making membership in the Alliance an extremely unappealing prospect. Neutral worlds, more often than not, are treated with the same contempt as enemies, making it obvious the only intention the CIS has is to force their own unique brand of oppression onto the wider galaxy. More often than not, they begin by deceiving the locals into accepting a limited separatist presence before immediately altering the deal, seizing or coercing the civilization with their military and taking complete control, though unofficially. And somewhere along the line, they seem to have killed Mando's parents. They're just lucky the CIS was dead and gone by the time Mando leveled. Sometimes in Naboo fashion, they're blockading the planet, starving them out and forcing them to join under duress. Other times, on more important worlds, they're supporting and manipulating the political opposition, orchestrating a coup. Meanwhile, on less important worlds, some of the Separatists are practicing full-blown slavery.
How can you do this?
A free pipeline of labour to be used in their vast production empire. Dooku even allowing the Zygerians to rebuild their slaver empire under his watch.
This is outrageous. It's unfair.
We also find out after the war that Dooku had been pillaging member worlds and amassing a personal fortune. So much for the Republic being corrupt. So of course, they're acting just as abhorrently when it comes to the actual war. They started the entire thing by attempting to kill 2 Jedi and a Republic politician for sport. And from then on, they take sick pleasure in torturing their enemies whenever the chance arises. They're even attacking Republic hospitals intentionally and attempting to test new weaponry on innocent populations.
So uncivilized.
In one of their most nefarious little schemes, they try to trick the Republic into attacking a droid foundry filled with a slave workforce in an attempt to elicit sympathy for their cause. But it seems far more likely that would backfire when people start wondering why those people were there at all.
This is a mistake, a terrible mistake. They've gone too far. This is madness.
Even their contracted allies are treated extremely poorly, which is something even the later Empire didn't usually do. These external contractors often disposed of the second their usefulness ends, which is surely not a great way of securing assistance in the future. Do they honestly believe they can waltz around the galaxy treating people this way without word beginning to spread? It's no wonder they have to resort to a droid army. They're not exactly going around inspiring loyalty. The Republic may have issues at this time, least of which being the secret Sith Lord bending it to its will. But the CIS ultimately show themselves to be a far worse alternative than the Republic ever was. What's a bit of corruption or neglect compared to having your world subjugated or worse? At least the Republic mostly leaves you alone. So inevitably word gets around about the Confederacy's misdeeds, leading prospective worlds to start questioning their intentions at their first appearance.
I have heard the tragic stories of worlds caught between your droids and their clones.
The welcome mat is starting to be withdrawn. Pockets of resistance are already popping up all over the CIS, mostly disgruntled workers unhappy with the lack of labour regulations. I think it's safe to say the time would come when the Confederacy leaders would be forced to give up the pretense and start crushing dissent and conquering worlds outright. But despite them spreading misery to all they encounter, ultimately there is no one the Council factions will harm more than themselves and their own people. Point 3. The Separatist leaders are nothing more than disposable pawns playing someone else's game, and everyone will suffer dearly for it. So as we've established, the lesser members of the Confederacy are more victims than anything else, crushed under the boot of the big industry leaders who rule over the others from the executive Separatist Council. Duplicitous by their very nature, these leaders at times work against each other and, like Sidious himself, attempt to play both sides of the conflict they helped start. Although they are fully declared members of the CIS, all but Dooku maintain a phony semblance of neutrality in the Senate, allowing them to continue to benefit from Republic representation, profit from trade deals, and receive other Republic perks. A ruse that over time becomes laughably unbelievable and probably wouldn't work at all if Sidious wasn't allowing it to. Despite being industry leaders, make no mistake, these corporations thoroughly represent their species and their respective worlds, deciding the fates of their own people and those of the larger Separatist alliance. So they're just as responsible for this entire mess as Dooku or Sidious, but with the added embarrassment of being the biggest suckers in this whole house of cards. Although no one in the CIS except Dooku knows Sidious's true identity, many of the Separatist leaders seem to know that a Dark Lord Sidious is calling most of the shots, seemingly taking no issue with it or questioning his motives.
You assume too much.
They've probably all been promised further wealth and power, but it's still a weird position for people who seem to take their independence very seriously. So let's get to know some of these moronic factions a little better and see if the Clone Wars actually provided any benefit to them at all. We've got the Stalgus and Hive representing the Geonosians, a servile insectoid race used to serve Dooku's ends.
Why do I sense we've picked up another pathetic life form?
Original manufacturers of the droid army and the first capital of the Confederacy, yet they don't even own the droid foundry they labor in. That would be the Techno-Union's Bactoid Combat Automata. The Geonosians are the equivalent of a state-managed union, offering up dirt-cheap labor while voluntarily keeping their workers in line. But then weirdly enough, they also designed the B-1s, which actually explains a few things, most obviously the physical resemblance they share with their creations. Poggle the Lesser lives up to his name when he follows Dooku's lead blindly. This guy isn't just politically naive, he's just plain vacant. Perhaps out of his depth after being raised up beyond his drone station by Dooku, the distant queen of the Stalgas and Hive not doing much better, seemingly agreeing with Poggle's appointment and going along with all the CIS shenanigans. But the true reason for the Geonosians' involvement is more sad than anything. They basically just needed something to keep them busy. Starved of Republic contracts for years, if they aren't committed to a project, these bugs will often break out in civil war. Next up, it's the intergalactic banking clan led by a race called the Mune. You'd think these bean counters would be calculating enough to remain neutral and profit from both sides of the conflict like normal war profiteers, but instead they join the CIS Executive Council, secretly favoring the Confederacy with interest-free loans while jacking up the Republic rate, all because banking clan leader San Hill has seemingly forgotten all about profit, driven by a personal grudge he holds against the Jedi and the Republic. A situation that results in the intergalactic banking clan having the distinct pleasure of being the only CIS council member faction to get well and truly rogered before the Clone Wars even end. On the verge of bankruptcy after the Separatists failed to make their loan payments, let alone pay any interest, Dooku, Palpatine, and a deceived Mune people endorsed this human as a supposedly neutral successor to the core 5 morons. One brain to replace 5, and this guy isn't all that bright, considering he makes his passcode his galactically famous crush. Surprisingly, Clovis did actually intend to remain neutral. Pity he's immediately blackmailed into cutting off the Republic and forgiving all Separatist debt. Sidious using this as a pretext to invade Scipio and bring the banking clan under full Republic control. Honestly though, this was probably a mercy compared to what happens to the other Separatists later. Next up, my personal favorites, the Techno-Union. Surprisingly not a collective of EDM enthusiasts. They're actually a guild of tech companies with about the technological prowess of your average ham radio enthusiast.
The Techno-Union Army.
Hello there.
Disposal count.
In the Techno-Union, it's the bizarre Skakoans taking the lead. But don't let their nefarious cyborg visage fool you, because that's actually a pressure suit and their biggest weakness. You could probably kill these guys just by sucker punching them right in the faceplate. Since they're gliding around like Daleks, also consider trying to knock them over or simply defeat them with a flight of stairs.
Is it possible to learn this power?
Side note, with the Daleks' homeworld named Skaro and the Skakoans Skako, I'm beginning to think their similarities may not have been a coincidence. The Skakoans are completely at odds with most galactic species, requiring a high-pressure atmosphere and methane to breathe. They'll explosively decompress on worlds most would consider habitable. There are hardly any planets the Skakoans can live on without their specialized suits, which keeps most of them at home and firmly out of harm's way, and maybe that's where they all should have stayed. This natural isolation supposedly making the Skakoans highly xenophobic, but you'd think with their massive physical vulnerabilities and extreme limitations, they'd want to play nice with the surrounding galactic republic which could crush them at any time. Instead, the Skakoans decide to pick a fight with most of the galaxy, the so-called xenophobic isolationists signing over their independence to the CIS, pumping out military hardware for the cause while profiting from the Republic as well. Most of the Grand Army's military hardware supplied by distant subsidiaries of the Techno-Union. They're literally giving their enemies the ability to wage war against them.
Greed can be a powerful ally.
It is said the Techno-Union's only loyalty is to war, and I assume by extension profits. But I can't imagine that belief involves getting personally involved in a conflict and having Union facilities fall under direct attack. Though at least the Techno leadership, despite their obvious vulnerabilities, are willing to get out there amongst it. But then they're doing just the dumbest stuff, like wasting time filling ships with treasure at a time when an evacuation was desperately needed.
Sir, the last shipments of treasure are approaching.
Does this guy want to get decompressed? Haven't you already made enough? And now we come to the superstars of the Separatist factions, the Trade Federation. Perhaps the dumbest and most cowardly of all, but then paradoxically also the most brazen. An outer rim conglomerate of businesses led by the Nemoidians. They got their start with the intention of protecting their business interests, sparring with the Republic for control of the outer rim and monopolizing the so-called free trade zones. The Trade Federation end up being little more than a corporate mafia, extorting protection money, bullying worlds into signing supposed trade deals and sabotaging smaller, unaffiliated businesses. And these wimps do all of this keeping a comfortable distance between themselves and their victims. The first of these cretins to deploy legions of military droids.
These Federation types are cowards.
I don't know about you guys, but I wouldn't really feel comfortable acting like galactic mobsters when the local constabulary are pious warrior wizards with laser swords who usually start by chopping people in half and maybe asking questions later. In typical Confederacy fashion, Newt Gunray was raised up to his position via an eternal political conspiracy supported by Sidious, with the promise of further power and profits down the road, which somewhat explains his initial willingness to do Sidious's bidding, but he seems to realize pretty quickly just how dangerous dealing with this guy can be.
This is getting out of hand. We should not have made this bargain.
Barely surviving the Naboo blockade, he moronically decides to join the Confederacy anyway, seemingly with full knowledge Sidious was still calling all the shots.
When Darth Sidious asked me to loan you the Federation fleet, you didn't say you were going to war?
At this point it should be obvious that Sidious is working completely towards his own agenda, and absolutely everyone is expendable to him, yet he doesn't warn any of the other factions of the dangers of dealing with him.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Even if I knew nothing about Sidious but his obscured hologram, he's just overtly dodgy.
You are not invulnerable, hologram.
And they say Nemoidians pride themselves on risk assessment. They might pride themselves on it, but they suck at it nonetheless. And considering he witnessed for himself that Sidious has some level of control over the Senate,
I have the Senate bogged down in procedures.
Newt is about the only CIS insider who could have made the link to Palpatine. Before joining the CIS, Newt naturally tries to leverage his position.
I am not signing your treaty until I have her head on my desk.
Refusing to sign the Separatist Charter until Padme is dead, and then signing it anyway even when attempts on her life fail. It was already a pointless personal grudge, but now he's made himself look like a weak pushover to his allies, who are actually more like enemies. During the war, Newt is out there taking unnecessary risks, risking the Federation's neutral status and even getting himself captured at one point, only saved by Sidious, Newt not realizing how close he came to being considered a liability.
Asajj Ventress will infiltrate the Jedi ship and either free Gunray or silence him.
And I'm afraid when it comes to the most hands-on of Separatist military leaders, things just go from bad to worse. Enter General Grievous, a random alien cyborg who got his start as a warlord, drawing the attention of Dooku. Grievous doesn't realize it, but he represents some kind of twisted middle ground between the droids and their biological leadership. Pity he doesn't have a leadership bone in his body, other than being confident enough to yell at droids. Believing he holds a prestigious position as the leader of the largest droid army to ever exist.
I am the leader of the most powerful droid army the galaxy has ever seen.
But then he also seems to detest his robotic subordinates.
That was impressive.
Grievous has a warped, disfigured mind to match his body. The truth is, he's probably driven by a sadistic urge to inflict suffering on others, perhaps to match his own.
Hate leads to suffering.
And the main target of his spite is of course the Jedi.
Future where there are no Jedi.
Unbeknownst to Grievous, he's raging against the wrong people, tricked into embracing his cybernetic body after his shuttle was sabotaged by the other Separatist leaders, with the whole thing blamed on the Jedi. You'd think at some point he'd realize the Jedi generally don't go around sabotaging shuttles. No, they'll happily end you face to face.
Your emotional reactions are preventing you from accurately judging how unlikely that is to be true.
Grievous is weirdly favored by Sidious, but it's not in any way he should be happy about.
General Grievous is a critical part of my plan for the Clone Wars.
The cyborg enjoying his position because of his prowess in personal combat, pretty handy for thinning out the Jedi ranks. But most importantly, he's also extremely easy to manipulate and predict, with the added bonus of not being militarily proficient enough to turn the war against the Republic, and obviously hamstrung by their crappy choice in soldier. And sorry, did I say Grievous was a decent fighter? At one point, the guy gets absolutely downtrailed by a pack of vengeful Gungans.
You saw a big doo-doo this time.
But no one within the CIS could have a greater number of miscalculations than the double agent himself, Count Dooku, a former Jedi Master who fell to the Sith Lord's manipulations, Sidious helping him reclaim his title and family fortune before he founded the phony secessionist movement and became its head of state. And obviously, we can give Dooku a bit of leeway around the issues in the CIS, since he's probably tempering their military threat level every step of the way, guiding them to meet the agenda of the Sith. It's not like he actually wants the Confederacy to work properly, but maybe, just maybe he should. Movie Dooku seems morally ambiguous, warning Kenobi of a secret Sith Lord and suggesting they team up to overthrow him.
What if I told you that the Republic was now under the control of the Dark Lord of the Sith? You must join me, Obi-Wan. And together, we will destroy the Sith.
But in the Clone Wars, Dooku is unapologetically evil and openly talks about his intention to overthrow his master, something he should be seeking to do by creed.
We will be even more powerful than Lord Sidious. We shall rule the galaxy together.
And the guy is absolutely lethal, seemingly good enough to take on Sidious one-on-one, yet he does close to nothing to actually get the jump on his master.
Patience. Use the Force. Think.
I mean, you don't even have to best Sidious in a lightsaber duel, just trick him into walking into the wrong room and vaporize him or something.
Do the magic hand thing!
If his plan was to wait until Sidious had created the Galactic Empire and then somehow seize it for himself, he makes no move to reach such a goal, content to just plod along until the end of the war, not a time Dooku should want to be around for.
This is a life-threatening situation, and your attention should be focused on one thing alone.
A full Republic takeover would be messy anyway, maybe impossible. Dooku would be far better off to simply hold his territory as leader of the Separatist Alliance, and utilize his existing infrastructure to strike against Sidious and his fledgling empire.
Do it.
And it goes without saying, but a few military and leadership upgrades wouldn't go amiss. He could also expose Palpatine's plot in detail to the Jedi and other factions, get a bit of a counter-conspiracy going to take him out.
We must find a way to contact our friends.
Dooku was already in the best possible position to take on Sidious, but he squanders it completely.
Much to learn you still have.
I'm still trying to figure out if Sidious bestowed Dooku with the title of Darth Tyrannus because he was grooming him to become a tyrant, or maybe because he is very old, powerful, and destined to go the way of the dinosaur. Dooku does take on several dark side apprentices with the hope their combined power might be enough to challenge his master, but then he doesn't actually work to overthrow him in any meaningful way. In fact, he bows down to every little demand Sidious puts on him, even when it massively weakens his position.
Eliminate her.
She's my most trusted.
I said, eliminate her.
Attempting to kill Ventress as ordered, Sidious doesn't even ask for proof of her death.
Asajj Ventress is dead.
Once again, you've proven your loyalty to me.
He obviously couldn't feel her continued presence. Dooku could have faked her death and had her carry on in secret. Though it's possible Darth Tyrannus started with good intentions, he fails to provide any kind of alternative to either the Sith or Jedi, and ultimately acts like any normal Sith. Aside from not going through with the whole usurping his master thing, he seems very ideologically confused.
A character's actions must flow inexorably from his or her established traits.
The only way Dooku's actions make sense to me is if he were actually just 100% loyal to Sidious all the way through, telling Obi-Wan and Anakin about a Dark Lord controlling the Senate and manipulating the war to sow a bit of confusion among the Jedi.
Sith control everything. You just don't know it.
And taking on apprentices to threaten his and Sidious's positions intentionally, just to keep everyone sharp. Or maybe he just enjoys having some subordinate Darksiders to toy with.
Gives you focus, makes you stronger.
Dooku should know better than anyone that his master will seek to replace him with a stronger apprentice eventually, as the Sith Code dictates. He should also be concerned that he is older than his master. He could be offed at any moment. The primary reason Sidious appears to be using Dooku is for his political abilities. The second his usefulness ends, he'll be done away with. Which of course is exactly what ends up happening. In his last moments, seemingly surprised by his master's betrayal.
Kill him now.
Failing to appeal to Anakin when a few choice words could have easily prevented his death, something Anakin was already reluctant to go through with. After grandstanding about nothing of consequence for the entirety of the Clone Wars, finally Dooku was lost for words. In fact, this whole phony Palpatine kidnapping scheme would have actually been the perfect time to lay a trap for Sidious. But nope, as usual, he just lets his master steer the ship.
Your focus determines your reality.
With the Separatist alliance and the war effort falling apart after Dooku's downfall, it's time for Sidious to take care of the rest of the hopeless pawns.
The end of the war is near, General.
But the loss of Count Dooku.
Sidious telling Grievous Dooku's death was necessary and that the war was almost over, despite the Separatists being no closer to winning it.
His death was a necessary loss.
Which you'd think would be ringing alarm bells for Grievous. Maybe you'll be next.
You must realize you are doomed.
So the Separatist leaders get dropped off at Mustafar without anything in the way of protection. At this point, if I were one of these dudes, I'd be gapping it back to my home system, maybe surrounding myself with security, because the situation is going south hard and no one here is providing anything in the way of direction.
Pack your things, we're leaving.
Instead, they just sit there waiting for something to happen, seemingly having no problem with the fate of the CIS being decided by a military leader. Meanwhile, Kenobi has been sent off to put down Grievous, who we find out was just as shoddily constructed as the droids he hated so much. Also, his organs appear to be highly flammable. With Grievous's death, the leadership of the Confederacy falling to Newt Gunray. Yep, they're all doomed. A recently corrupted, youngling-blooded Anakin rocks up to put them out of their misery.
Now this is pod racing.
Slaughtering Poggle, Wat Tambor, and the other Separatist leaders, including San Hill, who weirdly decided to show up and get murdered despite the intergalactic banking clan no longer being under his influence, and who should be pleading for peace at the very end than the tool who helped start this war.
Lord Sidious promised us peace. We only want...
Sidious wrapping things up by sending a droid shutdown order to the remaining Separatists, marking the end of the Clone Wars and the Dark Lord's undisputed victory, playing everyone on both sides of the aisle absolutely deftly. And it's not just the leaders who get punished severely for failing to see the Clone Wars for what they were. The larger CIS factions get a similar treatment under the new Galactic Empire.
Ouch time!
The Trade Federation is nationalized and has their assets and treasury plundered. Dooku's homeworld of Sereno gets a similar treatment, along with being orbitally bombarded and conquered outright, while the Techno Union is dissolved completely, its assets broken up and redistributed. But honestly, no one gets more punishment than the dumbass Geonosians. Forced to undertake work on the Death Star, Sidious resolves to wipe them from existence, merely to cover it all up, leaving one bug alive and the possibility of a few eggs at best.
You survived.
Though they were barely worth mentioning until now, the Commerce Guild, the Corporate Alliance, and the Retail Caucus lost their leadership in the Mustafar massacre as well, but the larger factions themselves are spared from total obliteration. As we already established in previous videos, sinking into the woodwork and being completely ineffectual is always the best way to survive the Empire.
The safest course of action is to avoid participation of any kind.
Their dead leaders can probably take solace in the fact that after being slaughtered by Darth Vader, their footnote in history is all but secured.
This is a happy moment.
It seems obvious by now the Emperor didn't just use the Clone Wars as a means to seize power and create the ultimate Jedi trap. He also used the conflict to make sure his empire remains unchallenged, maneuvering neutral worlds into Republic control while gathering up all these powerful, troublesome, non-human factions and individuals into one convenient package, and wiping them out all in one go, clearing the way for his human-centric empire. And so, as the Empire rises from the ashes of the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the slow decline of Sidious's mental faculties begins. A galactic empire ruthlessly impressive in its beginnings. But it won't be long before it succumbs to similar problems as the Separatists, a lesson Sidious never seemed to grasp. I'm beginning to think Windu's force lightning deflection did more than leave Sidious's exterior scarred and deformed. This may have just been the moment when the brain rot began to set in.